Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here. So I'm Isabelle Mejean from Sciences Po in Paris. And so I've been asked to talk about data and the empirics of international trade with a focus on more firm level stuff. And so when I started preparing for this lecture, actually, I saw that the topic is not necessarily very easy to tackle in 3 hours because data are a bit everywhere in international trade. This is a field that has a very strong articulation between theory and data. And so basically, whatever you're going to be taught about this week is going to involve some data. And so I want to try to avoid repeating too much what my colleagues are going to tell you about. So first, why is it the case that data are so central in international trade? I mean, they are in general in economics, but I think probably a bit more in international trade. And the reason, I think, or at least part of the reason, is that we do have a lot of data to play with. So in some fields of economics, data are really lacking, and people have to do experiments or go to historical books to find good data. It happens that in international trade, we don't need to do this. We have plenty of material to play with. And the reason is that data have been collected forever. So for instance, this is a picture of a clay tablet that has been found by archaeologists that dates from the Bronze Age. And that is obviously talking about something that I cannot really translate, but they are basically providing information about commercial information about cities and merchants that were involved in trade relationships at the time. So already in the Bronze Age, there were data that were collected about bilateral trade. So of course, now we are not very often using this type of data, although some people do, as in this QJ paper. So we have more data that are collected by simply customs administration. The second reason why we do use a lot of data in international trade is that there are many dimensions of this data that can be looked at. The data can be analyzed in the space dimension, obviously. Over time, the data are collected at a very narrow product level. And now, and this is going to be very important in what I'm going to talk about, we have a lot of data about how individual firms participate to international trade. So let me just give you an idea of these very many dimensions that we are talking about. So think of international trade for a single country. I took Israel as an example. So when you think about Israel as a country that participates to world trade, the first thing you can ask is, what are the goods that are traded by Israel? So what are the goods that Israel exports? And you get a picture that looks like something like this. So as I said, international trade data are available at a very narrow product level, so we can very easily understand and classify trade flows depending on the type of products that are exported. So as you can see, Israel is exporting a lot of services, but also a lot of diamonds, I didn't know, and also manufacturing goods. These are like kind of chemical goods, and these are more instruments and machines. Okay, so this is on the export side. What is Israel importing? On what is importing is, as you can see, the picture is a bit different, although not that much at the end of the day. So Israel is also importing a lot of services. Israel is obviously importing a lot of minerals, as a lot of countries in the world. And perhaps more surprisingly, you see that Israel is also importing a lot of diamonds. And already this is going to give you a hint of why nowadays in international trade, we are digging more and more into more disaggregated data. So this data are already quite disaggregated, but when you see this, you might wonder, why is it the case that this country is both exporting and importing the same goods? And the reason might be that these are not exactly the same goods. This might be different varieties of diamonds, and there might be two-way trade due to this type of horizontal differentiation. But also what is likely to happen in this specific case is that basically these two-way trade flows related to some form of involvement of Israel into the global value chain of working with diamonds. So importing, say, raw diamonds and then exporting cut diamonds. Okay, so this is one dimension that you can look at. Then you can think of the spatial dimension. Where is Israel exporting to? You get some map like this that are very typical of many countries in the world. So usually the country is going to export to countries that are relatively close by and relatively rich, and I'll come back on this later on. You can also think of this in terms of the time perspective. So how has the trade by or exports by Israel evolved over time? And for instance, here, you can think of this in terms of the share of Israel in world markets. And we cover pictures like this, showing how the country has lost over time in terms of its overall market share, which again is not very specific to Israel and very much reflect the fact that during this period, China and other big emerging markets have entered the world trade, and this has had a lot of consequences on the geography of international trade. So that's another dimension. And then you can even go into more details and think of international trade in terms of the technology that is involved into producing goods and then exporting these goods to the rest of the world. So this is one example of how you can think about this. Think about the complexity of the technology that is used to produce the goods that are exported. And then you see, again, a very different map whereby Israel is exporting goods that involve relatively low technologies or little complexity, and others that are much more sophisticated. And you see on average the level of economic complexity in the overall basket of exports. Okay, so that was just to illustrate the fact that with a given set of data, we trade economies can really come up with very different questions and address them with the multidimensional structure of this type of data. The last thing that I wanted to point it out in this introduction is that the field has been enriched over the last 20 years with many more data than it used to be. And in particular, we now have access to very good and very detailed data that help us dig into really the macroeconomic underpinnings of international trade flows. And this is what I'm going to mostly talk about. So just to illustrate this, I'm not sure it's the best way of illustrating this, but what I did is just a simple search on Google Scholar with the keyword firm level trade, and just plotting the number of responses that I get on Google Scholar based on these keywords over time. And as you can see, clearly there has been an increase in the use or study of firm level trade over the last 20 years. And just to give a comparison point, I plotted the results from just economics in general, just to show that this increase is not due to the fact that in general, economics is better covered by Google Scholar over time. Okay, so what you see is that this firm level, I mean, basically, and what I'm going to argue is that the field has really shifted from analyzing trade from the perspective of trade between countries to analyzing trade between individual firms that are involved in international good markets. And this is something that has changed a lot the way we think of the empirics of trade. Okay, so that's the first thing I wanted to talk about in this introduction. And then again, I'm going to say a lot of things that are going to be covered in different ways by different participants to this summer school. So I thought one way to perhaps differentiate myself is to talk about the kind of boring elements that are related to the empirics of trade. So try to think about this question in terms of the geeky details that nobody cares about except people that are actually practicing the use of data for international trade. So of course, I'm not going to talk only about the geeky details, but let me, throughout this lecture, perhaps tell you a little about the data. What are exactly the data we are manipulating? What are the technical difficulties that we might want to take into account when digging into firm-level trade data. So in order to do this, you first need to understand where this data come from. And as you all know, the reason why we have a lot of data on international trade is because there are barriers to international trade flows, so that each country has a custom administration that is collecting data at entry and at exit of all goods and services. So you're familiar with this form if you're traveling to the US, you're familiar with this type of pictures if you're interested in international trade. And surrounding these two elements are the administration, the US Customs and Border Protection, which is basically collecting data on what you're bringing into the US or what boats are bringing into the US or exiting from the US. Okay, so what is important is that every single trade flow that can be quite modest, including like you bringing enough data to the US, is going to give rise to a customs declaration. And this is true when the good or the service exit the country and when it enters the country. So this means that for every single bilateral trade transaction, there are two declarations at entry and at exits, which are called these mirror flows. So this is good because we have a way also to check the quality of the data, since we have two administrations collecting the same data. And this is the type of thing we can do based on the comparison of these mirror flows. The data in general are sort of as being of good quality. Why is it the case? Because the purpose of collecting the data is to collect taxes. And whenever taxes are involved, usually countries put in place a good administration to collect good quality data. So just to give you an idea, these are summary statistics about the prevalence of international trade taxes across countries. So this is expressed in percentage from overall tax revenues. And as you can see, there is some variation across countries and regions in the world in terms of how prevalent international trade taxes are. But what is striking as well is that you do see at the top of this graph the less developed countries. So that is something that is well known from public economists, that international trade taxes are a fiscal instrument that is very often used by less developed countries, because these are taxes that are relatively easy to collect. You don't need a huge administration to collect trade data. You just need custom borders a bit everywhere and just collect the taxes directly. So this means that this type of data are going to be good, including for countries that usually do not provide a lot of data. Okay, in terms of the sources, I told you I'm going to talk a bit about the details. And I think it can be useful in case you also want to, or you're already using this type of data. So the way we are going to get access to trade data when we want to start some empirical work implies going to different sources. So as I said, the primary source of the collection of the data are national customs administration. And a lot of customs administration are providing access to some data, sometimes data that are already aggregated in most cases, and sometimes, as is the case in of those countries that I've listed here, but many more, that these administrations are also providing access to the most disaggregated data, the raw data that are collected, as I said, at each transaction that is passing the frontier. So today I'm going to talk a lot about French data. You know, I'm French, as you understood from my accent, and you know that French are always a bit like self-centered. So I'm going to talk a lot about French data because I'm using French data a lot. And in the particular field of international trade data, I think it's fair to say that French data have been used more than data from the rest of the world, just because France has given access to this data earlier than other countries, and it's easier to get access to this data. So in case somebody is interested in getting access to French data, I've written documentation on this and explaining how you can do this, what are the conditions, etc. So I'm very happy to discuss even these very boring details. So of course, when you get access to data from a single administration, you're going to have to focus your analysis on a single country. There are also multilateral data that are used by many researchers, eventually in complement to this. So for instance, Comtrade is probably the most exhaustive data set covering all bilateral flows and at a fairly disaggregated level. Yeah, I didn't say it yet, but today I'm going to talk about a lot about the empirics of trade in goods, because the data are much easier to get access to. Trade in services is by far more difficult to measure, and there are still some useful sources. So I'll tell you a bit about trade in services, because it happens that in France we have relatively good data on trade in services. But generally speaking, it's very difficult to get good data on trade in services, which up to now has not been very much of a problem, because most of international trade is in goods, but trade in services is rising very fast. So there it might be a problem soon. Yes?
I was just curious how the UN gets their data.
So they're basically collecting from all customs administration and basically harmonizing everything to constitute this Comtrade. And as I will explain before, something that is nice with international trade is that the product nomenclature is harmonized at the international level, so that the definition of products is the same across all customs administration. Okay, so let me end this introduction with explaining a bit where we're heading. And here I think you need to keep in mind that I'm very happy to be flexible. I prepared many slides, much more than I'll be able to discuss, but I try to be kind of broad. And if some of these elements are well known to you, you can just like try to express this and I'll try to go very fast on what it is. I think the first section should be kind of standard, so I'll try to go very quickly on this. It's basically not involving any firm level data. I'm just going to remind you of what is the starting point for trade economists that are willing to use data, which is this so-called gravity equation that we are all using a lot. But again, I'm going to go very fast on this. I still think it's useful to have the gravity equation in mind when you go to firm level data, because basically gravity also holds at the micro level data, at the microeconomic level, sorry. So this is what I'm going to start with in this section. So here I'm going to really start digging into the granularity of trade data, talking a bit about firms in the global economy, what data we can use to discuss this question, what are basically the main stylized facts that we've recovered over the last 20 years about this dimension of international trade. And I'll talk more about this aspect, which is more part of my own research agenda that looks at the very big firms, so the big players in international trade that I'm going to call the happy few. And then, so this will be mostly centered around firms in aggregate trade flows. And then I'll try to dig into more dimensions of the data that we can exploit and what we can get from this additional dimension. So the product dimension is something that has been studied a lot. Now I'm working, and others are working more and digging more into the buyer margin of international trade. What is the structure of the portfolio of customers that individual firms are serving in the international market, and what we can learn from this. I'm also going to discuss a bit trade dynamics, which is something that obviously in aggregate data has been studied a lot, but studying this question from the point of view of individual firms involves more complication. And I'll finish with some results recovered from studying prices and the price of goods that are exported and imported by individual firms. So that is the plan for the whole 3 hours. And hopefully I'll have time to discuss all of this, but obviously it's not exhaustive. There are many more things that are done with firm level data. And I think there are many more things that can be done with still additional dimensions that have not been much exploited yet. So if you want to discuss this into more detail, I'm very happy to. As I hope is clear from this introduction, I'm very much a geek. I like data a lot. I like talking about data. So I'm never going to be bored by questions related to my kind of hobby. I know it's a bit of a weird hobby, but that's how it is. Okay, so if there are no questions, or there are no, I'm going to, as I said, go very quickly over this. I think you all have learned or heard about the gravity equation, which is really kind of the empirical model that has structured international trade, at least over, I mean, it's been used for more than 50 years now, but I think it's fair to say that the gravity equation has been very central in the way international trade has evolved over the last 20 years. So this gravity equation at the beginning is a very simple empirical model that has been shown to be quite successful in explaining the cross-section of trade flows. So who is exporting to who. And this empirical model basically explains bilateral trade, so the value of export between a country I and a country J, by the size, the product of the size of these two countries, and a gravity term here, which is a negative function of the distance between those two countries. And obviously, if you know a little about gravity in physics, you see the analogy to the law of gravity that has been formalized by Newton. So this is basically the model that I'm going to develop over the next 10 minutes. So the notations I'll try to be consistent. So I, in what I'm going to say, is always going to be the country that exports. J is the country that imports. SI is going to be a measure of the size of the country. Perhaps I'll be a bit more specific afterwards. MJ is going to be the importer's size or its market potential. And DIJ is a measure of distance between those countries, and I can augment the model with other measure of cultural distance, institutional distance, etc., etc. But the idea is that the further away the countries, the less trade. So as I said, this has been used for 50 years. I added a slide on the kind of history of gravity, which I think is interesting. At the very beginning, this model was really used as an empirical tool to kind of discipline or understand the structure of international trade, but most trade economists that were more into theory were kind of discarding this model because it lacked theoretical underpinnings. And what we've seen over the last 20 years is that the theoretical literature has very much evolved around this gravity equation, which is now a central component of many models in international trade.
What's exactly G?
So G is just a constant. So in the Newton version, it would be the gravity constant. Here, it's going to be a constant in a log linear model. Okay, so the gravity equation, as I said, is very central. Krugman referred to it as one example of social physics, as he named it, which he referred to as kind of a law-like empirical regularity that characterize social interactions, and in this particular case, interaction over a trade relationship. Okay, so let me take 5 minutes to just illustrate this gravity equation. I'm sure you saw some related graphs before. So these two graphs are meant to illustrate the impact of the size of countries for international trade. And this is based on bilateral data between Japan and individual European countries, here on the export side, here on the import side. And the countries are ranked according to their GDP, using Greece as a comparison point. And as you can see, there is a very strong fit between the value of exports or imports between Japan and a given European country and the size of this country. And the slope of this relationship is very close to 1. So the elasticity of trade with respect to the size of the country is usually estimated around 1. Okay, so the countries that trade together tend to be large countries. And then the distance effect has been illustrated in many different ways. This is where I'm starting to be centered around France. Again, I apologize for this, but this is using either French exports or French imports towards all countries in the world, and then comparing these countries in terms of their distance from France. And as you can see, France is mostly exporting to countries that are close by and also importing from countries that are close by. And this is true, but we can think of this as being a consequence of the European integration. What you see is that when we distinguish in this graph the countries that are either part of the EU or the Eurozone, it's not clear that there is something specific about these countries beyond distance. But of course, in order to conclude, we would need to think a bit more about the correlation between distance and the likelihood of forming a trade agreement. But generally speaking, what we see is that there is clearly a very strong relationship between trade and distance. There are some elements that seem to matter. So here, for instance, we see in red the countries that are French speaking that tend to cluster above the line. So France tends to trade more with countries that are French speaking. The ones that are perhaps the most striking are the former colonies of trade that still trade more with the country despite the countries being independent. Yes?
A stylized fact that I've heard about, and you probably know about this, is that borders seem to make a big difference.
Yeah, so I'm going to
talk about that.
Border. So then I can answer. I'm going to talk a bit about border. The reason why I'm not going to discuss this a lot is that in order to, so there are two things that are border effect, but indeed it's difficult to identify separately from distance because usually your neighboring countries are close by. So when you have a large enough set of countries and a country that is sufficiently small, then eventually you can identify separately a border effect and the effect of distance. And there is something else that people have done to identify the impact of border is to compare the amount of trade within a country and between a country and a neighboring country. And this is going to be useful to identify a border effect. The reason why it's difficult to do is that we do have a lot of data on international trade, much less on intranational trade, for the very reason that there are no taxes associated. There are VAT taxes that can be used for this, but the data are much more difficult to get access to. So this is partly the reason why I'm not going to talk much about this, because we don't have very good data on trade between firms that are located in the same country. There are some, so I'll discuss a bit. Okay, so these are the two main elements of the gravity equation. Perhaps I can skip this. I don't know if you've, yeah, I see people nodding. So I understand that you're kind of familiar with this. So as I said, the gravity equation was initially an empirical relationship that was very successful. Over the last 10, 20 years, there have been a lot of efforts that have been put into like kind of putting structure into the gravity equation. And perhaps what is funny about that is that now I think we almost have too many theoretical frameworks that can be used to rationalize the gravity equation. So that's what is discussed in particular in this very nice chapter of the Handbook of International Economics by Head and Meyer, which is really discussing the micro foundation of the gravity equation and also the kind of empirical details that you might be interested in. But basically, just to summarize, what we can say is that modern theories of international trade almost all admit a gravity structure under some specific parametric assumption. In order to get a gravity structure into your theoretical model, you need to impose some structure. That's not very surprising. So if you take the right parametric assumption, you can easily recover a gravity structure under some common assumptions. So in order to obtain a gravity structure, most of the time you're going to have to impose that the production involves some linear cost function and some iceberg trade cost. So iceberg trade cost in the sense that in order to serve a given destination, you need to pay an extra cost, which is this iceberg trade cost. And importantly, this iceberg trade cost needs to be to enter multiplicatively in the cost function of the firm. So for a long time, I really thought of iceberg trade cost as being very difficult to sell to students. But since I found this very nice picture, I really decided that now I can stick with iceberg, because it happens sometimes that when you travel over a very long distance, I mean, the reason why at the beginning, I was a bit uncomfortable with this assumption is that the multiplicative form is very important and very constraining. And the way it's been explained for a long time is that basically the reason why it's called iceberg is that when you sell goods over the ocean, eventually some of it is going to be melted like an iceberg shrinking while traveling, which obviously is kind of a weird assumption. Most of the time you don't lose part of your goods when selling them over a long distance, except that it can happen that basically the boat I mean, that the goods disappear and melt in the ocean. So that's not very important. I just wanted here to point out that this assumption that trade barriers are going to enter multiplicatively in most trade models, including in some models that you're going to be taught about during this, summer school, is very important. And in particular, it's very important to recover this gravity equation. The second assumption that is very important and that is more discussed in the literature is that the structure of the demand for imports need to have a very specific structure, which is the CES system, that basically says that the way bilateral trade adjusts to shocks to trade barriers, so iceberg trade cost shocks, is very constrained in the sense that what is assumed in gravity models is that shocks to the trade cost between A prime and J is going to only have an impact on the bilateral trade flow to a first order. Then it can have general equilibrium effect, but the direct effect is only felt by the pair that is supporting this change or this increase in trade cost. And the second assumption, so this is saying that this partial derivative is zero. And the second important assumption is that the elasticity is constant. So this is this epsilon. So under this demand system, that again is very common in the trade literature, and together with these two additional assumptions, you can very easily derive structurally a gravity equation. So these are just examples of models that are consistent with gravity. So the most often used nowadays are Eaton and Kortum, or perhaps also Melitz. And these two models can be made consistent with the gravity equation under some specific parametric assumption. So in particular, in the Eaton-Kortum model, you need to impose that the distribution of those comparative advantages that are central into the model are distributed Fréchet. In the Melitz case, you need to assume a Pareto distribution of productivities. But if you're willing to make this kind of strong parametric assumption, then you can explain what we see in the data, which is the gravity structure. Yes.
Have the assumptions themselves been examined empirically?
Yeah, so I'll come back on this because the Melitz model is more often used to analyze firm level data. So Pareto doesn't seem to, I mean, there are controversies. Let's say Pareto is not a bad assumption, at least if you go to the right tail of the distribution of firm size, which is really the tail that we care about in international trade, because it's mostly the large firms that participate to trade. So yeah, this one has been kind of tested. The Fréchet distribution for comparative advantages is much more difficult to test because it is related to some technological parameter distribution that is difficult to approximate. Okay, so that's basically kind of the theory that you can put in order to justify the gravity equation, but in a way I should not care because I'm here to talk about data, and we can even use data without much structure. I'm kidding here because I think what is very nice with international trade is that it is very rare that we use data without a formal structural model in mind. I mean, there is a lot of interaction between theory and data, and my taste, I mean, from my point of view, it's a very nice feature of the field. So I'll come back on the theory a lot. Okay, so what are the kind of empirical challenges that you need to keep in mind if you want to run a gravity equation? And again, that will be still important once we dig into firm level data. The first empirical challenge that has been extensively discussed in the trade literature is how you control for this variables that capture the size of the country. So initially, the way the gravity equation was estimated is by just controlling for size using GDP. But once people have tried to put more structure into the gravity equation, they quickly realized that it's not sufficient to control for GDP, because in particular, the capacity of a country as an exporter or as an importer is going to depend on the whole vector of trade costs that are entering the structural model. So basically, a country that is going to, say, enter into the WTO, China, is going to become more important as an importer and as an exporter, because entry into the WTO is basically changing the market potential of the country and it's also its capacity as an exporter. Okay, so that means that you need to think about better way of controlling for these so-called multilateral resistant terms. Now, the way the literature has converged is by not solving the problem, but just using a statistical trick, which is to control for these terms by using two-way fixed effect whenever you're using multilateral trade data. So the kind of best practice nowadays is to use this two-way fixed effect to really control as much as possible for all the elements that are going to affect the capacity of a country to export and its likelihood to import. So this is the best practice, but a lot of what I'm going to do today is not going to use two-way fixed effect. Why is it? Because I'm going to focus on firm level data. Firm level data are usually available for a single country. And once you don't have the multilateral dimension, it's no longer possible to control for two-way fixed effect. Okay, so if you have access to multilateral data, it's always better to control for most things using this fixed effect, so saturate your model as much as possible. I'm not going to be able to do this, so you need to keep in mind that whatever I'm saying is not going to be so clean in terms of controlling for these terms. The second empirical challenge that is going to be even more important once we dig into firm level data are the zeros. And this is a very important problem because in practice, trade matrices are full of zeros. These are extremely sparse networks. Trade networks are extremely sparse. So you see a lot of zeros, which is kind of a problem because the first thing you would do with the gravity equation I told you about before is just to log linearize and estimate with OLS, which amounts to neglecting all the zeros that are populating your trade matrix. So of course, this is a problem. There's a whole literature on the topic. I'm not sure that the literature has fully converged yet, even though now it's becoming more and more common to use kind of pseudo maximum likelihood techniques in order to keep the zeros in the empirical model. It's kind of a trick that works, but that does not still fully solve the problem because what is problematic in those zeros is that they are not put at random into the trade matrix. The reason why some countries do not trade together is related to a lot of things that you might want your model to explain. So basically, the best way you would like to do this is to use some form of two-stage approach, whereby you explain why is it the case that two countries start a trade relationship, and then eventually conditional on a trade relationship, you're going to explain how much these countries trade together. So this would be the ideal approach. The problem is that in order to implement this type of approach empirically, you need to have an exclusion variable, a variable that is going to explain why you do trade and that is not affecting how much you trade conditional on a non-zero trade flow. And this exclusion variable is a bit difficult to find. Okay, last empirical challenge is about something that I've worked on a lot, at least some years ago, which is all the issues that are related to heterogeneity. So by definition, and this is related to the structural assumption I told you about before, the gravity model is going to identify parameters from the cross-section, so from the bilateral pairs and the fact that trade flows vary a lot in the bilateral dimension. And thus, when estimating a gravity model, you have no choice but to assume that the coefficients that are entering the gravity equation are homogeneous across country pairs. This is where you identify the coefficient, and thus you have to impose some homogeneity here. Worse than this, a lot of the in a lot of situations, you're going to estimate the gravity equation from aggregate data, if any, because you want to minimize a bit the problem of zeros, and the more aggregated you go, the less zeros. So you might be tempted to estimate the gravity equation using aggregate trade flows, but this means that you're also going to impose some homogeneity assumption across sectors and products that are constituting this aggregate trade flow. And this is a problem because first, this homogeneity assumption has strong consequences. And why does it have strong consequences? Because in practice, when we estimate the coefficients of the gravity equation or whatever trade equation from more disaggregated data, what we see is that there is a lot of heterogeneity across sectors, across products within a sector, etc. So the more disaggregated you go, the easier it is to control for this heterogeneity. When you use aggregate data, there is always this problem of heterogeneity bias that is around. There is a very nice paper that is forthcoming in Bristad that is really discussing this particular point into details, using as baseline framework the Poisson pseudo-maximum likelihood model that I just told you is better to, that is now used in most gravity estimations. Okay, so these are important empirical challenges. I'm not sure I'm going to come back on this later on, but you need to keep in mind that what I'm saying for whatever is annoying in estimating the gravity equation from aggregate data is becoming even worse when you start digging into more disaggregated data. Okay, so perhaps I can skip this or avoid discussing it too much, but just to say that this equation is very standard, and because it's very standard, there are tons of papers that are estimating a form of gravity equation. So this is taken from a meta-analysis that is covering like 2,500 papers that are each estimating a gravity equation. So as you can see, we have plenty of examples. So perhaps we can just look at this set that are the papers that are estimating a structural gravity equation, by which I mean controlling for two-way fixed effect. And as you can see, basically, we have a lot of evidence consistent with the gravity model. So the distance coefficient is always negative and very significant. The size of countries can be, structural here means that it's controlling for multilateral terms. So we see evidence for additional source of trade barriers. So contiguity is indeed positively associated with trade. So countries that are neighbors tend to trade more together. Countries that share the same language tend to trade more together. The colonial linkages matter a lot, even well after the end of the colonial relationship. Regional trade agreements, free trade agreements, participation to the European Union, to the NAFTA are all very positively associated with trade. There has been a lot of literature on the impact of sharing a common currency. And as I said earlier, there is also some papers that are also using intra-country data so that they can identify by how much countries trade with themselves more than with foreign countries. And this always find very strong positive effect. So just to give like average numbers, so the average distance effect is around -1. Contiguity is associated on average with 65% more trade. Colonial linkages are very important as well. There is a lot more uncertainty regarding what is the impact of WTO participation, participating to a regional trade agreements. There is more uncertainty here just because there is a lot of heterogeneity in those agreements, and thus it's difficult to identify a single coefficient from institutional agreements that are very heterogeneous. Okay, so that's for the gravity equation. I told you I'll go very quickly on it. So let me skip this and just finish with something that perhaps you've not as much used to seeing, because it's much less common in the literature, which is evidence for gravity also in services. So as I said, there are tons of papers that are estimating a gravity model based on trade data for goods, but much less for services, for the very reason that we don't know much about trade in services. So here I'm just like adding as a bonus one estimation that is based on French data and French export data within the European Union. So something that is nice with France, and I don't want to oversell my country, but the fact that France is part of the European Union implies, and this might be surprising, that it has even more disaggregated data, despite the fact that there are no longer borders within the European Union. And the reason why we have a lot of data on what happens within the EU is basically that there are important tax issues associated with this, in particular regarding VAT compensation. So the fact that there are no borders means that there are no control at the border by definition, but still in order to basically cope with the fact that European member countries have different VAT rates, the members have organized some collection of data on intra-EU trade flows that are then used and aggregated to compensate, to calculate, how the VAT that has been collected by one country and that needs to be reimbursed to another country. So that's a bit like technical, but what it means is that there are a lot of very good data within the European Union on both trade in goods and in services. So this is what I'm using here, and I'm going to use this data later. But what you can see from this that might be a bit surprising is that the gravity equation works pretty well on service trade. And so, for instance, the impact of distance on the amount of trade between France and EU member is very strong and very significant, even though by definition, the trade cost associated with this type of services is very limited. Okay, so what does this mean is that initially when people have started estimating gravity equation, the interpretation of the negative distance effect is that it's more costly to sell your goods on a longer distance. But now what we see is that this is also true for goods which trade costs, physical trade costs are very reduced, because exporting a service in, say, Ireland just involve clicking on a button, but still France continues to export much more in close by countries than in countries that are further away within the European Union.
Can you say which kind of services?
So here the services, yeah. So for instance, in the ad tech industry, so Google Ireland can sell, or Google France, for instance, can sell some advertising to a company which is located in Ireland, and this is going to be counted as a service. I'm not going to enter into details, into the details of trading services because it's much more complicated than this. There are much more flows that are considered as trading services that are not in my data. But here the data that I'm talking about are really like all the declaration of French firms, so firms that are located in France and paying taxes in France, and that have sold some services to firms that are located outside of France. Okay.
What are those superscripts, A and C?
Yeah, sorry. A is significant at 1%, B is at 5%, and C is at 10%. Sorry. The only thing that is important here is that obviously when you start thinking about trading services, there is a very huge elephant in the room, which is tax optimization. And this is an important problem within the European Union because we have two tax havens in the European Union, which are Ireland and Luxembourg. And what we see in data is that indeed France exports much more services in Ireland and Luxembourg than everywhere else. So this is why here we've put this dummy for this tax haven. Okay, but I'm not going to dig too much into this question. Okay, so it took me, yeah, almost an hour, 50 minutes to just cover things that you knew about. Yeah. Yeah, it's a general problem, and it's a problem also just because listing what is trading services is extremely complicated. So eventually we can discuss this more. In this particular instance, it's again with, I mean, these data are only going to cover part of trading services because, for instance, a firm which has an affiliate in a foreign country and is selling to foreign customers through its affiliate is considered as an exporter of services under the definition of trading services, but we don't have this here. So here we are going to have only, I think it's mode 2, I'm not sure, but so part of trading services. And here it happens that the data collection and the data are thought to be operatively high quality, again, because it is based on some tax purposes. So these data are collected by they are not collected by the customs, they are collected by the Ministry of Finance and the tax administration. And firms are facing very important risk if they are not declaring this export properly. Actually, this is one of the biggest risks for small firms because there is always a bit of uncertainty about whether you have to or not, or whether you don't have to declare. But the risk in case of an audit is very high because it's VAT, and VAT is systematically related to large amount because it's based on your turnover, not your profit. So there is always a very high risk associated with whatever tax audit regarding VAT. So it's a very important concern for firms. And for this very reason, we think of this data as being operatively high quality. But they are limited to a very small subset of trading services. So I'm not claiming here that based on this, we have a good view of international trading services. But at least what we have, we think of as being of good quality. And as I will explain later, the data that I've been aggregating here are available at an extremely narrow level. So we have the declaration of each firm located in France, and the declaration is at the firm-to-firm level. So we actually know whether it's Google Ireland that is at the other side of the border. So these are very good data. Okay, again, this was in a way unrelated to what is supposed to be the topic of this lecture. So now let's start talking about firms in this environment. So first, the geeky part. So the customs are collecting the data at the level of each transaction. So each time a firm exports to a country, there is a tax customs form that is filled. And thus, we can really use this granularity in order to dig into the micro level underpinnings of these trade flows that people have been studying over the last 50 years. So in particular, we are going to have access to information regarding the firm that is doing the declaration. So either the firm that exports, if it's an export flow, or the firm that imports in case of an import flow. And these firm identifiers are going to be very useful. First, we're going to be able merging export and import data in order to study two-way trade. And this is going to start being very important if we want to understand better what happens in those huge global value chains that I guess Paul Antras is going to tell you about, that Bob just mentioned quickly at the end of his course. So global value chains are a very big element of international trade, and it's very badly known in terms of the data for the reason that we don't have good data on global value chains. So one way to make progress into the direction of understanding how those global value chains are working is to focus on individual firms that are part of those global value chains, and how are you going to define what are those firms, eventually by looking at these two-way trades. So basically, sometimes you may want to say that a firm that is importing some of its inputs and exporting part of its output is a firm that basically participates to a global value chain. And so this source of information might be useful to identify those firms. So this is the first thing you can do based on that, and you can also merge, in many cases, this data with additional firm level data. So in many countries, this can be merged with balance sheet data to have information about the structure of the firm, its technology. It can be linked with employer-employee linked data to know what are the employees that work in firms that participate to trade. We can have access to ownership data to know whether part of this trade is organized within multinational companies. In some cases, and this goes back to the discussion we had before, it's possible to link this data with VAT data. VAT data are going to tell you something about trade between firms within a country. And so this is possible in some countries. In particular, Belgium is offering very good data on both intra firm-to-firm relationship and also international relationship. It's possible also to merge this data with credit register, and more things are done over time. So in the French context, what is very nice, I think, is that all this data are assembled in a single server. And so it's very easy to merge all the data together once you have access to this server. Okay, so as I said, now there are many countries that give access to some firm level data. So I'm going to mostly talk about France, but I think France and the US were the first countries to give access to this type of data, but now almost, I mean, every single day I see a paper that is using different firm level data. So, and there are many data that are better in terms of the dimensionality than France. There are unfortunately no cross-country data set with all the granularity of the data, but there are few attempts to consolidate this data. So for instance, the ECB has a nice project whereby they're asking members of the Eurozone to compute the same statistics on their own firm level data, and then they put together those statistics to kind of dig into the comparability of statistics across countries. but this is still very much work in progress. So as of today, if you want to use firm level data, most of the time you'll have to focus on one particular country. And as I said, there are many less countries that give access to firm level data on trade in services. Okay, so how do I want to think about the firm dimension based on what I've already done? So until now, we've mostly considered trade from a cross-country perspective. So it's like export from I to J, but by definition, this aggregate trade flow is aggregating all the transactions that involve a firm that is exporting from country I and an importer that is importing in country J over a particular period. So once you have access to firm level data, it becomes very easy to dig into this granularity. There are many different ways you can do this. So here I'm proposing 3 decompositions. So you can decompose export between I and J in terms of the number of exporters that are active in I and selling in J times the mean value of their export. By definition, this is equal to this. You can take the perspective of importers and decompose bilateral imports in terms of the number of firms that import from that country times how much they import on average. You can dig into the number of firm-to-firm relationship, how many firm-to-firm relationship are active in the bilateral flow from I and J times how much they trade together on average. And then you can, do even more complicated things. So if you do this type of decomposition, the first thing you can do is to decompose how much of the variance in those trade flows comes from the numbers or from the mean value of what is exported. So this is usually referred to as the extensive margin of trade, and this would be the intensive margin of trade. But as you can see in this slide, there are many extensive margins of trade and many intensive margins of trade. So the first thing I do is just to do a simple variance decomposition to see how much of the variance in bilateral trade flows can be explained by the extensive or the intensive margin. So here is what I obtain when I take all exports and imports by French firms towards all countries in the world and decompose the variance in bilateral trade flows in terms of what in this variance comes from differences in the number of firms that are serving the country versus how much these firms export to that country. And here is how much of the variance is explained by, in import trade flows is explained by differences in the number of firms that are importing from that country versus how much these firms import from that country. Okay, so this is a very simple way of decomposing trade by using these two relationships. So as you can see from the decomposition, basically the extensive margin is very important, and this is why we need to understand how firms decide to participate to trade, because when it comes to explaining bilateral trade flows, so those that we've tried to explain based on the gravity equation, what we see is that at least half of the variance that we've exploited up to now is explained by differences in the number of firms that participate to the trade flow across countries. When we use the EU intra-EU data, as I told you, the intra-EU data are very rich, and in particular, they give information at the firm-to-firm level. So in intra-EU data, we are able to, in intra-EU export data, we have access to information on the firm that is exporting and also its partner in the European Union. So we can do even more in terms of decomposing the aggregate trade flows in terms of the intensive and the extensive margin. So this is what I do here for goods and services. So same thing, I can decompose bilateral trade in different ways. And again, I find that the exporter margin, so how many firms are exporting to a country, is still responsible for about 50% of the variance. Within the EU, we see that the importer margin, how many firms are importing from France, is very important. And the same is true of the exporter-importer margin. So if you want to understand the variance of bilateral trade flow between France and a given EU member country, you really need to understand how firms in the EU are establishing firm-to-firm relationship. And this is something that I'll talk about afterwards. Okay, and we have kind of the same thing with services. Although for services, the importer margin seems to be a bit less important. The reason being that in the data on services, we do see huge importers. So I'm not supposed to talk about any single firm, but let's assume that there is one firm in Ireland, which is named Noodle. And this firm is very big. And thus, in order to understand why France is exporting a lot to Ireland, you really need to understand the flow of goods that are flying to Noodle Island. Okay. So that's a very simple way of understanding what is hiding in the data that I've talked about up to now. And so let me skip this. And then, as I told you before, one reason why I cared about the gravity equation and spend some time explaining the gravity equation is because when you start digging into the firm level data, you still find that the gravity equation is a kind of useful model to keep in mind. So here what I'm doing is re-estimating the gravity equation that I told you about before. So this is kind of the same thing that I've discussed before. But now I can re-estimate the gravity equation using each component of the bilateral trade flow. And this tells me how much of the gravity coefficient comes from heterogeneity in the number of firms that are exporting to a given country. And here is the part of the gravity equation that comes from heterogeneity across countries in the mean value of export per firm. And so if I'm not mistaken, if I did it properly, all coefficients should add up to the first one. This is because I just estimated an exact decomposition of X in terms of the extensive and the intensive margin. And thus you can interpret the size of the coefficient in terms of how much it contributes to explaining the corresponding coefficient that you get from a gravity equation. So for instance, in the case of distance, which I think is an interesting coefficient that people have analyzed a lot, what you see is that in this sample that I have, the distance elasticity is a bit smaller than usual. It's at about 0.56. But more interestingly, what you see is that almost everything comes from the impact of distance on the number of firms that are serving this particular country, and almost nothing from the intensive margin, which I think is kind of important to understand, because traditional models of international trade would really explain the gravity equation by the intensive margin, while what we see in the data is that the extensive margin is very important in understanding this distance effect. Yes?
So is there a difference between like the type of firms that operate longer distance and shorter distance? So how much, we have wholesalers substituting direct customers?
So I'm going to dig a bit into this, and then we can discuss a bit further if I'm not addressing your question. But indeed, now the question is really, why is it that the extensive margin is so sensitive to distance? Why is it that many more firms export to Belgium than to New Zealand? It might seem a bit obvious that it is the case. Not all firms export to New Zealand. But what we see in the data that I think is the main insight that we have here is that overall, this question is much more important than how the value of trade adjusts over a long distance. This is true for distance, but for other coefficients, it's less true. For instance, the impact of the size of the country is kind of equally explained by the extensive and the intensive margin. Yes?
Can you reconcile that finding with the iceberg theory that was supposedly underlying?
So the iceberg theory is very much about this. So that's what I was referring to. So now modern theories of international trade, in particular Melitz, has really been the most important paper here at really trying to explain how firms self-select into export and self-select into difficult markets. So these papers are very much about this, while the more standard theories that assume this iceberg cost were mostly concerned with this. But the Melitz model that can rationalize the structural gravity equation still requires iceberg. So I'm not going to pretend that it solves everything. What I'm saying here is really that understanding how firms participate to trade is important quantitatively. Okay, the second thing that we can do once we have access to firm level data is to get rid of the question of how you explain the cross-section of aggregate trade flows and now start digging into how firms participate to trade and how they decide on where to export. And so what this means here is that now I'm going to really start digging into micro level data. As you can see, the number of observations is rising quite a lot. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking the value of export for each individual firm in France that I have in my data. And the first thing I'm going to do is to try explain why some firms export much more than others. And the way I'm going to start explaining this is by asking whether the reason why some firms export much more than others is mostly because they export to more markets, or whether they export more to each of the markets that they serve. Okay, so this is what I do here. I'm doing the same type of extensive intensive margin decomposition, but now the decomposition is done at the level of a single firm, and I'm looking at heterogeneity across firms. And here, what you see is that the decomposition still suggests both elements are important, the extensive and the intensive margin. But now what we see is that when we start thinking about individual firms, the intensive margin starts being much more important. So for instance, if you want to explain heterogeneity across firms in terms of the value of their export, you see that about 10% of this variance is explained by the fact that firms do not serve the same number of countries abroad, and 90% is due to the fact that some firms are just selling more to each of the markets that they serve. Okay, and you again can do this with more margins. I'm not going to comment upon everything, but again, once you have data at the firm-to-firm level, you can dig into the extensive margin in terms of the number of countries that are served, but you can also think about this in terms of the number of individual firms that you have in your portfolio of partners abroad. And here as well, what we see is that this number explains a substantial share of the heterogeneity that we see in the data. Okay. So here what you see is that the extensive margin becomes less important, which might seem a bit surprising, but still the extensive margin should still be considered if you think of how much it explains why firms export more to some countries. So here again, I'm working within the gravity model, explaining the heterogeneity of trade flows within a particular firm across countries. And as you would expect, this heterogeneity is well explained by a few variables that enter the gravity equation. So firms tend to sell more in closer countries and in countries that are larger in size. And again, we can decompose this into what comes from the extensive and the intensive margin. And again, as you can see, the extensive margin is part of the problem. Okay, it's becoming a bit repetitive, so let me just finish, stop with this boring decomposition. I hope from that you understood that basically now we want to understand better both this extensive margin, how firms participate to trade, how many countries they serve, etc. But we also want to understand a bit of the intensive margin. So I think you should all be familiar or kind of have heard about the Melitz model, which has been the very first model explaining this question, studying this question of how firms participate to international trade, coming up with a relatively simple model that displays this assumption. So the Melitz model assumes that there is heterogeneity across individual firms here in terms of their productivity, but you can think about this more broadly. So firms are different ex ante. They compete under monopolistic competition. So each of these firms is behaving as if it is atomistic. And importantly, the assumption that is key in Melitz is that in order to serve a particular market, a firm is going to have to pay a fixed cost, which is going to enter negatively into its operational profits. So these are operational profit for a firm that is endowed with productivity phi, that wants to serve market J. And under the assumption of the Melitz model, these profits have a very simple additive form. What does this additive form buys you is basically this very simple prediction regarding the self-selection of firms into exporting. As long as there is a fixed component involved into exporting, naturally there will be a process of self-selection whereby only the firms that are sufficiently productive are going to find it worth paying the fixed cost of exporting. And this means that these are the ones that we are going to find in our firm level data. Okay, so this is basically summarizing the Melitz model. The Melitz model was published in 2003, but we already had some evidence at the time that this type of selection of firms into exporting, perhaps I need to stay closer to the camera. We already had some evidence at the time that indeed there is heterogeneity across firms in terms of their participation to trade. So this is what the Melitz model tells you. So you have an underlying distribution of firm size, and here we are assuming this distribution is distributed follows a power law. And so in red, you have the distribution of firm sales induced by this power law distribution under autarky. And then what happens is that when the country participates to international trade, firms are going to self-select into exporting. And this means that some firms that are above some threshold of productivity are going to decide to export to that country. And then the more productive they are, the more they export to that country. And the initial model was with just 2 countries, but you can easily extend to multiple countries. And then if you assume that those FJ are heterogeneous across countries, there are some countries that are more difficult than others to serve, then you're going to have a process whereby the very large firms are going to serve many different countries. And then when you move left to the distribution, you're going to have firms that are serving a smaller and smaller set of countries up to the point where the firm is only serving the domestic market. So if you have this type of self-selection into more and more difficult countries, what happens is that from a power law distribution, you're going to have the export sales that are going to affect this distribution of firms, because firms that are above a threshold are going to start serving one market, the one that is easy. For France, it's basically Belgium or Germany. And then firms that are a bit more productive are going to start serving another market, say Spain. And then you can go this way along the whole distribution of possible destination for countries. And you're going to have the most productive firms, the ones that are really, really productive, that serve all those countries and accumulate sales over all those destinations. And this is going to make the distribution of firm size more fat-tailed than you would have if the country was in autarky. Okay, so this is a very important prediction of the Melitz model that has been tested a little bit. Okay, One way to kind of get some support to this prediction is by comparing first firms that export and firms that do not, and comparing these firms along various dimensions. So here, those firms are compared in terms of their employment, their value added, the mean level of their wages, their capital intensity, their skill intensity. And the table is showing results that are recovered from many different countries. And what you see here kind of clearly is that there is a regularity, which is that there is an export premium for large firms. So what I mean here is that systematically, firms that export are better on many dimensions. So they tend to be larger in terms of their employment, sales, value added. They tend to be better in terms of the wages they pay. They tend to be more capital intensive, skill intensive, etc. And this is true in almost all countries that we have data for. So this can, I mean, at least the first 2-3 columns can easily be rationalized in the context of a Melitz model. Again, there is selection, and thus those that end up exporting are better on average than the rest. You can also augment the Melitz model with some elements of comparative advantage, and then you're also going to explain this premium in terms of capital intensity and skill intensity, at least for developed countries that we think of having a comparative advantage in capital intensive or skill intensive goods. The second part of the table is looking at the premium in terms of size for firms that not only export, but also invest in foreign countries, so FDI makers. And what we see here as well is that there is a big premium for those firms. So those firms are way larger than the average, even more than exporters. And this can be rationalized in the context of the model by Helpman, Melitz, and Isabelle, which is basically assuming there is an additional fixed cost if you want to serve a foreign market through FDI. That was related to your question, I think. And then it's there's again going to be a selection mechanism whereby it's the very, very top firms that are going to decide to do this type of investment. Okay. There are many more ways we can measure this trade premium of large firms. So let me just explain this graph, and then I'll go a bit quicker. But the graph is useful because I like representing this type of stuff using the same type of graph. So what I'm showing here is a cumulative distribution of firms in terms of the intensity with which they participate to trade. So here on the left-hand side, you're going to have on the x-axis the share of foreign inputs in a firm's intermediate consumption, which is 0 if the firm only sources its input from the domestic economy, and go to 1 if everything is sourced from abroad. And on the right-hand side, the x-axis is the share of exports in the firm's overall sales. That again is 0 if the firm is not an exporter, and then goes to 1 when the firm exports a lot of its production. And on this graph, you see 2 lines. The red line is a cumulative distribution that gives a weight of the same weight to all firms in the economy. So it's an unweighted cumulative distribution. And the blue line is doing the same thing, but weighting firms by their here value added, by their size. So what is useful in using this type of representation is that you get a lot of information regarding the heterogeneity across firms. So let's start with the left-hand side panel and the red line. What we see here in the red line is that in the French data, at least, there are many firms which source all of their inputs from the domestic economy. This is about like 87% of French firms do not import at all, at least directly. Eventually, they can purchase inputs that have been imported before through wholesaler, but they don't have any direct participation to international trade. So most firms in France are not exposed directly to foreign inputs through their intermediate consumption. And then you do see some firms still among those 30% of firms that import some of their inputs. Some have a very large share of their intermediate consumption that comes from foreign inputs. These are the firms that are here, like more than 40% of the firm's intermediate consumption is sourced from foreign countries. Okay, and then, so once you've seen this, the first thing you see is that there is heterogeneity in participation to trade. And very few firms actually participate directly to trade, at least on the import side. As you can see from the right-hand side, it's much more common for a firm to export rather than import. But the second thing that is interesting is to see the difference between the unweighted and weighted distribution. Once I start taking into account the fact that the firms that import are different from the firms that do not, I see a very different picture. So in particular, among the 87% of firms that do not import at all, combined together, these firms, so the 87% of firms that do not import represent about 40% of the aggregate value added in France. Okay, so what this means is that even though there are many of those, they are smaller than the average, and thus in the aggregate that do not matter as much as you would think if you only had information about the red line. And then what you see is that on the other hand, the firms that import a lot of their inputs, so for instance, those that import more than 40% of their intermediate consumption, there are like 1 or 2% of these firms, but they represent like 10 to 15% of aggregate value added. So these are very large firms. And we see this, for import, but we see the same thing for export. Now let me skip this. So this is in terms of the number of countries, same thing, many firms conditional on exporting or importing interact with very few countries. But once you take into account their share in the aggregate, you see that the large ones that export or import or trade with many countries, they account for a large chunk of the aggregate trade, aggregate value added, etc. Okay, so this goes to my last point for today, and perhaps I'll continue on the topic on Sunday. But this is where I think my research is starting to really, the point that is much more related to my own research, which is this question of large firms in international trade. And here I want to start with this first bullet point. I told you before, the Melitz model is extremely used in international trade. It's the first model that started thinking of firms as being heterogeneous in their productivity. But an important trick for solving this model was to keep on assuming that these firms, even those that are very, very, very productive, they behave as if they are atomistic. So they really like compete under monopolistic competition with firms that are way smaller. So this is a very convenient assumption in terms of solving the model. But what we see in the data is that this is unlikely to be the case. Why is it unlikely to be the case? Because the distribution of firm size that we observe in the data is extremely fat-tailed. Okay, so this is one illustration of this fat-tailedness. What I do here is to, it's not me, it's based on US data. You have the same type of thing for French data. What is done here is to make a plot of this PDF of the frequencies of firms at a given level of sales over the whole distribution. That here is assumed to follow a power law, so that in log it's a line. And what you see is that first the data seems to validate pretty well this assumption that the distribution follows the power law. But more interestingly, from this, we can get an estimate of the slope. And the slope implies that the power law is actually very fat-tailed. And we're actually very close to what is called the zip flow, which is a special case of a power law with a coefficient that tends to 1. And what we know from statistics is that when the distribution of, in this case, firm size is zip, the K largest firms, so the ones that are at the very right of the distribution, are going to start accounting for a finite share of aggregate sales, even if there is an infinity of firms. So really, what you see in the data is that the Pareto assumption might not be that bad, the power law assumption. But more importantly, what we see in the data is that the distribution is very, very fat-tailed. Okay. And so once you see that in the data, we have firms that should have market power, it becomes a bit difficult to maintain the assumption of monopolistic competition that we are using in order to solve the model. So there is a very nice paper by Eaton, Kortum, and Sotelo that I encourage you to read if you've not before, which is really like bringing this idea that there might be some granular firms in the economy into the Melitz model. And the trick in order to get some analytical results is to keep the structure of Melitz, but then say that there is a support of firm which is continuous, but then in ex post, there will be only a finite number of such firms that are active in the economy. And so Eaton, Kortum, and Sotelo just draw this finite number of firms into the Pareto distribution that many people are using when working with the Melitz structure. And so what this means is that ex post, the distribution of firm size is going to be determined by a finite number of draws into this Pareto distribution. And you can, with a positive and quite high probability, end up with some firms that are very, very productive and thus are going to be very, very large. And once you have this, even, in general, once you have this finite number of firms, it becomes better to get rid of the assumption of monopolistic competition. And what they do is to solve the model under Bertrand competition so that firms interact, there are strategic interactions that give rise to endogenous markup. So instead of assuming that all firms, even the very, very productive, display the same markup, the paper is showing how to solve the game under Bertrand competition and obtain the kind of nice prediction that the very top firms that account for a large chunk of aggregate trade and aggregate value added exerts some market power and set higher markups. So I think I need to stop here, right? So I'll continue on this topic on Sunday. And in the meantime, if there are topics that you're particularly interested in, you can send me an email. I'm not sure I'll adjust everything, but if there are topics related to firms that you would like to see, I'm very happy to think at least about a way to discuss this on Sunday. Thank you.
Thank you.